Quick demo of this video. Here we'll implement ASP.NET Core Web API CRUD operations with Angular using Entity Framework Core and SQL Server. To insert a new record, fill up this form here. At last, 3-digit security code and expiration date. Now submit the form. So here we have successfully inserted the payment details of Eva. The list of payment details is updated to fetch the newly inserted record. Now if you want to update a record, select the corresponding item from the list, then the corresponding record details will be populated inside the form. Let's update this card owner name, then submit the form. That's it. You could see the newly updated value inside the list. To remove an existing record, click on this trash icon, then confirm the operation. That's it. We have deleted the record from our application. We have built this project from scratch step by step so that you can learn a lot and apply the same in your upcoming projects. I'm sure you will find this tutorial helpful, so please watch till the end of the video. Now let's create the ASP.NET Core Web API project. For that, here is my Visual Studio 2022. Now let's create a new project. So here is the project template, ASP.NET Core Web API. You could easily find this template if you select these options from the top drop downs here. Now click on Next. In order to demonstrate the CRUD operations, we will be dealing with payment details of a customer. So I will name this API as Payment API. Now select the location where you want to save this project. Click on Next. So here we have the latest .NET 7 framework selected. Since this is a demonstration project, I will uncheck this option for HTTPS configuration. And we'll be using the normal default API controllers instead of minimal APIs, and we want to enable this option for Open API support. This feature, Open API, allows us to test various endpoints inside the Web API using Swagger UI. Now let's create the project. So that's it. So here we have the brand new ASP.NET Core Web API project. Now some of you might be surprised to see my Solution Explorer on this left panel instead of right, which is the default configuration in Visual Studio. But as a fanboy of VS Code editor, I want to keep it on left hand side like the Browser Explorer in VS Code. Now without further ado, let's go ahead with implementing the CRUD operations inside the API. For that, first of all, we need an entity framework model. So I will create a new folder called models. Inside that, we'll have this model class payment detail. First of all, we have the primary key, which is called as payment detail ID. Now, in order to mark this property as the primary key, we have to add this attribute here, key. Now, in order to add the corresponding using statement, hold Ctrl, then press period. Now select this data annotations using statement. That's it. Now let's add rest of the properties. Card owner name, card number, expiration date, and finally security code. Now you could see the green squiggly line here indicating non-nullable property must contain a non-null value when exiting the constructor. Consider declaring the property as nullable. Now this warning is due to a C# feature called nullable. Now if you want to know more about nullable, you can go through this MSDN documentation here. I have given the link in video description. In brief, this feature is only applicable to reference type like string, object, arrays, etc. That's why we are not seeing the warning for this integer property here. Now when this nullable feature is enabled, it will try to minimize the error null reference exception. Now when it comes to this model class here, suppose we are going to create an instance of this class like this. The default value of these string properties will be null. So when we refer that somewhere inside the application, we will get this error, null reference exception. In order to prevent that from happening, this nullable feature gives us the warning that we must initialize these properties. Now to resolve this problem, you can disable this feature by going to project configuration here. Just disable this feature here. That's it. But I won't recommend doing it. So let's enable this feature because we are ignoring the opportunity to catch possible null reference errors in advance. So let's do it in the proper way. For that, let's initialize these properties with their default values like this. Now since we are creating this DB model class for a later DB migration, these properties will be converted to a physical table columns. And the columns corresponding to these string properties will be having the data type nvarchar_max, which is more than what we need. So better specify the column type with this attribute here, column. Let's add the corresponding using statement with the same shortcut, hold Ctrl then press period. Now let's specify the column type here, nvarchar100. Now let's do the same for rest of the properties. For card number internationally, we expect 16 characters. Expiration date, we expect this format MMYY. So number of characters will be 5, and then we have security code which is corresponding to CVV or CVC. So normally it would be a 3 character. Now with this model class created here, let's create the DB context class. As you know, the DB context class will act as an intermediate in between DB model classes and the physical DB. So let's create the class inside the folder models. So here we go, payment detail context. Now in order to convert this normal class into a DB context class, we have to inherit this class from the parent class DB context, which is from Entity Framework Core. So let's install the required NuGet packages for Entity Framework Core. In order to install the NuGet packages, right-click on Dependencies from the Solution Explorer, then click on Manage NuGet Packages. Inside this Browse tab, search for Entity Framework Core. In here, we have to install 2 packages. First of all, we have Entity Framework Core SQL Server, which acts as a DB provider. Since we are working with SQL Server database, we have to install this package here, SQL Server. And then after that, we have this package, Entity Framework Core Tools, which helps us in DB migration through Package Manager console commands, which you are going to see in a bit. And it also helps us in creating the API controller using scaffolding mechanism. Now, apart from these 2 packages, we also need this primary package, Entity Framework Core. That will be installed along with this DB provider package, SQL Server, as a dependency. So let's install these packages one by one. Now let's install this tools package. This green tick here indicates both of these packages are installed, and you could see the same packages under this dependencies packages here. So these are the 2 packages that we have just installed, and you could see the primary package inside the SQL Server under this relational package here, Entity Framework Core. So these are the required NuGet packages to work with Entity Framework Core. Now back to the DB context class. Now let's continue with the development by adding the using statement for this parent class DB context from the Entity Framework Core package here. Now as always, we need to add a constructor for the DB context class. In order to add a constructor for an existing class, you can use this snippet CTOR, then double tap. But there is a more straightforward method. Right click on this context class, then select this option, Quick Actions and Refactoring. Now select this generate option for the constructor with this constructor parameter. That's it. Now we need to talk about this constructor. Now before that, let me add a property for this class of the type dbSet for the model that we have just created here, payment detail. And we'll name this property as payment details. Now the reason for adding this dbSet property is that we are telling the DB context class that we need a physical table corresponding to this model here. And also we'll be using this dbSet property in order to query or modify the corresponding physical table. Now let's talk about this constructor here. It has a parameter of the type DB context options. Into it, we have to pass 2 informations. First, for the DB provider, whether we want to use SQL Server, MySQL Server, etc. And then we have to pass the corresponding physical DB connection string also. So that will be passed from this program.cs file here through dependency injection. For now, I will do the dependency injection here, and later once we create a controller inside the API, I will explain how it works. For that, we can make use of this builder object, builder.services.addDBContext. So basically with this injection, an instance of the DB context class will be created, and then it will be shared throughout the application when required. That part can be discussed later once we create the controller. For now, let me complete this statement here. So we want to create an instance of the type payment detail context. And inside that, we have to pass the value for the corresponding constructor that we have here. So into it, we have to pass both the DB provider and the corresponding DB connection string. For that, here we have a lambda expression with this options parameter. So here we go, options dot use SQL Server method can be called. So what we are saying is that we want to use SQL Server DB for this DB context class. Now inside this method, we have to pass the corresponding DB connection string. For that, first of all, we'll save the connection string inside this app settings.json file like this, connection strings, and we will save the connection string under this key dev connection. For now, I will just paste the connection string template like this. So first of all, we have to provide the server name, which is the instance name that we have provided while installing the SQL Server instance, then the database name. Then since we are using local authentication, I will set this trusted connection as true. And then we also need to set this key here, trust server certificate. And finally, in order to execute multiple query batches, we want to set this key multiple active result sets as true. Now let's provide the proper SQL Server instance name, which you can copy from the login window while connecting with the SQL Server instance. For me, I will be using this SQL Server Management Studio here. So here is the server name. Let me copy this and I will paste that here. And then we have to provide a DB name which is not created yet, that will be created using DB migration in a bit. Since we are dealing with payment details, I will name this DB as payment detail DB. So that's all about connection string. Now let's pass the same inside this method here. In order to retrieve the data from this JSON file, we could make use of this builder object like this, builder.configuration.get connection string method can be called, and we just need to provide the corresponding key that we have provided, which is dev connection. Now we are done with the entity framework model and the corresponding DB context class. Now let's go ahead with the DB migration. Migration is the process of creating physical DB from the model and the DB context class that we have provided here. So before doing the migration, first of all, try to build this project here. So the build went successful. If there is any error, try to fix that first, then go for the migration. In order to do the migration, select the project, then go to Tools, then NuGet Package Manager, then Package Manager Console. For me, it is already open inside this bottom tab here, Package Manager Console. Now let me expand this like this. Now for migration, there are two commands. First of all, we have to execute this command, add migration. After that, we have to provide a name for this migration so that we can refer the migration later if necessary. So I will name it as force migration. Hit enter. Now as a result of executing this add migration command, here we have a new folder called migrations. Within that we have a C# file with the same name as that of the migration here, force migration. You could see the file here. It consists of C# codes for creating the actual physical DB. Meaning that with the command that we have just executed, there is no physical DB created inside the SQL Server. For that, we have to execute this second command here, update database. And thereby the C# migration file will be executed. So executing this command will result in creating the actual physical DB with the given entity models. Hit enter. So it looks like everything went successful. Now some of you might get an error if there is any error in the given connection string here, because this is the first time we connect with the DB with the given connection string here. So if there is any error in the given connection string, you will see an error inside the package manager console here. So don't get frightened, just confirm what you have given inside the connection string first. Now let's check the management studio whether we have created the actual physical DB or not. Let's expand this databases node here. So here we have the DB payment detail DB. Inside this tables node, you could see the table with the name payment detail, which is what we have given inside this context class DB set property here. So the table corresponding to this model class payment detail will be having the name payment details. Now let's check the table design to know whether it is created as per the given entity framework model here. So first of all, we have the primary key, then card owner name, card number, expiration date, and security code. All of these properties having the same data type that we have given here. And here we have the primary key payment detail ID. If you expand the column properties, you could see that it is set as identity specification so that we don't want to insert values into it. It will start from 1 and increment by 1 upon new record insertion. So that's all about creating DB through migration. Currently this table is empty. Now let's check how to insert records into this table from our API here. For that, we'll be creating an API controller with necessary web methods for the CRUD operations. Now from this left panel, select API. Now select this template here, API with actions using entity framework, not this read-write endpoints. Now click on add. Now since we are creating a controller for payment detail, I will select the model class as payment detail, and then the DB context will be the DB context that we have created, payment detail context. Now let's name this controller as payment detail controller. Now click on add. So here we have the controller. Now while creating this controller, some of you might get an error saying that there was an error in running the selected code generator. I have already solved this problem in one of my previous video. I have given the link in video description. Please watch that video to fix the problem if you are getting an error like this. Now before getting into each of these web methods, let's talk about the constructor of this controller and how dependency injection works inside the controller. Now as you can see here, this payment detail controller is a normal C# class which is inherited from this base class controller base from ASP.NET Core, as you can see here. And thereby this becomes an API controller. Now inside this application, we are not manually creating an instance of this payment detail controller class. It will be automatically created by the framework, ASP.NET Core framework itself, when we make an HTTP request into any of these Web API methods in it. So when an instance of this controller is created, this constructor will be invoked. And this constructor is having a parameter of the type payment detail context as context, and which is assigned to a private property of the same type payment detail context as read-only. Now in rest of the Web API methods inside this controller, this private read-only property is used to interact with the DB. But from where do we pass the value of this parameter payment detail context into the controller? So there comes the importance of dependency injection that we have done inside this program.cs file here. Here, an instance of this payment detail context is created by passing the values for its constructor parameter here, which are the DB provider and the corresponding DB connection string. Now, the created instance of the DB context will be shared among controllers having the same constructor parameter of the same type payment detail context. And then the same is assigned to this read-only property as we have mentioned before. So that's how dependency injection works in ASP.NET Core. If the concept of dependency injection is not there, then we have to create instance of DB context class in each of the controllers by passing the DB provider and the DB connection string like we have done inside the program.cs file. So hope you realize the convenience of using dependency injection in these situations. Now we'll be creating the client side of this API in Angular in a bit. Before that, we want to verify the working of these Web API methods in implementing the CRUD operations within this Web API methods here. And also, most importantly, we want to talk about the case transformation while receiving and returning data from this API. For that, first of all, let's run this application without debugging by clicking on this icon here. Now what you are seeing is that a Swagger UI to test various endpoints inside our API, which is added by default into the application since we have enabled Open API support while creating the application. So here we have the controller that we have just created, payment detail, and below that we could see various endpoints from the Web API methods in it. First of all, let's execute this getWeb method here. Click on try it out, then click on execute. So here we got an empty array as a response because there is no record in corresponding table payment detail. Now let's check what's happening with this get request here. So here we have made a get request to this URL. Now if you check the program.cs file, you can see that the routing of this API is left to the controllers. Now if you check this payment detail controller, the corresponding route is specified here. API / then a placeholder for the name of the controller, which is in this case payment detail. So that's why this URI is formed, API / payment detail. So with this get request, this get web method is invoked. Now there is one more get web method, but it accepts an ID parameter here. We will talk about that in a bit. Now first of all, it is checking whether we have a corresponding table or not. If it is not there, a 404 not found response will be returned. We already have such a table, thereby this return statement will be executed. Within it, the DB set is converted to a corresponding list, thereby we will get an array of objects in the response here. Now let's insert a record into this table. For that, we have to invoke this Web API method here, post. Okay, for that, we have to make the request into this endpoint post. Click on try it out. As you can see here, this web method accepts a payment model instance containing the values of the new record. So that's what we are passing inside the request body as a JSON object. We don't have to pass a value for the ID as we have already mentioned. So while inserting records into this table, the value of this column will be automatically added by the SQL Server engine itself, starting from 1 and incremented by 1 upon new record insertion, as you can see here. So let's leave that property as 0. Now let's provide the corresponding card owner name. Now as you can see inside the corresponding model, we have specified the length of the card number to maximum 16 digits. So I will pass the card number like this. Then we have expiration date in the format month, then year of expiration, then security code. Click on execute. Boom, that's it. We successfully executed the request. You could see the return response body here. Let's check whether it is inserted to the table or not. That's it. Now let's check how it is implemented inside the post Web API method here. So the object that we have passed inside the request body will be binded to this property here, payment detail, which is the parameter of this method. Now before talking about this web method parameter binding, let's check how this method is inserting the record. Now first of all, like we have done inside the getWeb method, we will check whether a corresponding table is present or not. It's already there, so the new object instance will be added to the corresponding DB set, and then we just need to invoke this method save changes from the context instance here. In background, Entity Framework Core will take care of executing the naked SQL script for inserting the corresponding object. So that's how a new record is inserted through the Entity Framework Core. And here we have the response returned with this method created at action. You could see the corresponding response here having the status code 201 indicating a new record is added at the server side. You could see this object passed as a third parameter to this function created at action. After this insert operation here, the Entity Framework Core will update the inserted values, including the primary key, into this object here. So that's why we have the inserted object returned here. Now, apart from this last parameter here, these two parameters will form or generate a URL to retrieve the newly inserted record. You could see the same URL here. Let me copy this and let's try to make a GET request to the same URL. Boom. Now this GET request is handled within this second getWeb method here. The getWeb method having a parameter ID. That's why this getWeb method getPaymentDetail is passed inside this created at action. So an URL to this getWeb method with this new ID is passed within this function. Inside that, first of all, we'll check whether we have a corresponding table or not. And with this method find async, the corresponding given ID record will be fetched. If it is not present, a not found response will be returned. If it is present, the corresponding object will be returned. That's what we have got here. You could make the same GET request from the Swagger UI also. See the second GET request with the ID. Click on try it out, pass 1, click on execute. That's it. So that's how this post web method works. Now I'm not going to test the working of rest of put and delete web method. We'll make use of them from the Angular application, so don't worry about that. Now before getting into the Angular part, I want to talk about the binding of model into these web methods here. Now some of you might have already noticed this payment detail model properties are defined with Pascal casing. But while inserting them here, we are passing camel casing. Now if you don't know what is meant by camel casing and Pascal casing, in Pascal casing each of the words in the given name here, first character will be uppercased. In this given name, we have few words: payment. So its first character is uppercase, then detail, first character is uppercase, then ID, so and so. But in case of camel casing, all words starts with uppercasing except the first word. See? So that's how camel casing and Pascal casing works. Even though we have defined these properties using Pascal casing, the returned response from the Web API converted the case Pascal casing into camel casing. So this is a common convention strictly followed by C# and JavaScript developers. In C#, properties are named using Pascal casing. But while in case of JavaScript and JavaScript client-side applications, we name properties using camel casing. Now these conventions are strictly followed in both of these languages. So these conversions are done by ASP.NET Core framework itself by default, from Pascal casing to camel casing and vice versa. So while returning something, it will convert the Pascal casing to camel casing, and when we are passing some data, we have to pass that in camel casing as we have done inside this post Web API method here. Then only it will bind to the corresponding properties within these parameters here. Okay, suppose we have misspelled this ID property like this, then it won't bind to the corresponding Web API model property, payment detail within the Web API here. So that's one thing you should consider while passing data to the server side. Now before getting into Angular development, let me briefly explain what's happening within this put web method and delete web method. We'll be making a put request to this Web API method when we want to update a specific record. We have to pass the ID as part of the URL like this, and it will be accepted with this ID parameter, and then we have to pass an instance of the payment detail with the updated values. First of all, it will compare the ID of the parameter with the ID within this instance here. If they match each other, it will go for the update operation, else it will return a bad request with the status 400. In order to update an existing record inside the entity framework, we just need to specify the state of the record as modified. And then we just need to invoke this same method, save changes async, so that the new changes within this pass object will be updated to the corresponding SQL Server record. Now in case of update operation, we want to handle concurrency exception because there will be a scenario when multiple users trying to update a single record. If we allow that, it will affect the integrity of the data. Now since we have enclosed this save changes method within a try block, if multiple users are trying to update the same record, it will be handled within this catch block. Only one of them get the chance to update the record. Rest of the requests will be handled within this catch block. So with this if clause, we will check whether the record that we are looking for is already present or not using this method payment detail exists here. Okay. If it is not present, it will return a not found response. Otherwise, it will throw an error like this. Now, if you want to know more about concurrency exception, I have given a document, MSDN document link in video description. You can go through that. Now, if there is no concurrency exception, it will return a no content response indicating that the put web method executed successfully. And finally, we have the delete web method. So first of all, it will check whether we have the table or not, and then it will find the corresponding payment detail record with the given ID using this method find async. If it is not present, it will return a not found response. If it is present, it will delete the record from the table like this. First of all, it will remove the specific instance of the payment detail from DB set. And finally, with this save changes method, the record will be deleted from the corresponding table. And finally, here also, if everything went successful, a no content response will be returned like this. So here we have a solid .NET Core Web API implemented all of the CRUD operations in it. Now without changing any of these web methods, you could consume these web methods from our client-side Angular app to implement the CRUD operation on client-side. But based on your app requirement, you might need to change here and there in these web methods. That I will be showing you while developing our Angular application. But don't worry about that. If you master these basics and fundamentals that we are discussing here, you could easily do that. Okay? Now with that being said, let's create our client-side app in Angular. Now I will create the Angular app inside this folder where we have already created our Web API. To create the Angular app, first of all, we have to open command prompt from this same folder directory. So I will use this shortcut. Just replace this folder path here with cmd, then hit enter. so that it will open the command prompt from the same folder directory as that of this folder. Now to create the Angular project, you can use this command ng new, the name of the application. Let it be payment app. Now I just want to bring this into your attention. If you are using an old version of Angular and if you want to update it to the latest version, you can execute these commands here, npm commands. For uninstalling the current version, you can execute this command, and this command will install the latest version of Angular CLI. Now with that being said, if you want to know more about this ng new command, you can go to the official documentation here, angular.io, then search here ng new. So here we have the CLI command. Go for it. Inside that, you could see the detailed documentation on using this command and also available arguments and options for the command. Now let's consider the default component, app component. It will be having files like one for TypeScript, which is the original TypeScript file. We can't ignore that. Then we have the HTML file for the template. We can't ignore that. The rest of these files, style sheet CSS file and the test file with the extension spec.ts are optional. For this demonstration purpose, I don't need both of those files. So while creating the Angular app itself, we can say that we don't need these component specific files. So in order to skip the component specific style sheet with the extension CSS, we can use this option here like this. Let me copy this and I will paste that here. Let me maximize this. So this is the option, and there is also a simple alias here, -s. Now like this, you can skip the test file using this option here, skip test. You can use this option here, or you can use this alias here, -S. Now finally, I want to use this option here, skip git, so that it will skip initializing the project for Git repository. So here we have the alias -g. Now hit enter. Would you like to add routing? No. Which style sheet format would you like to use? I will stick with CSS. Currently it is installing some default npm packages into the project. It may take a while based on your internet speed, so please be patient. Finally, here we have done with the app creation and installing the necessary packages into it. As a result of that, you could see the new folder here, payment app. Now in order to work with this Angular app, we are going to use VS Code editor. So first of all, let's navigate into the folder that we have just created. Now to open the same in VS Code, you could use this command code space period. Hit enter. That's it. So here we have the brand new Angular app open in VS Code editor. Now without explaining anything further, let me run this application. For that, let's open a terminal. In order to run this application, you can use this command ng serve then -o. Hit enter. It will compile the project and open the same in your default web browser. So this is how the brand new Angular app looks like. Now let's check from where does these default elements are rendered. So back to VS Code. So here we have the src folder. Most of our development will be there inside this folder, and the configuration of this project, Angular project, will be there inside this JSON Angular JSON file, and you could see the installed npm packages inside this JSON file package.json. Now let's check what's there inside this src folder. Here we have the root index.html, where we have the HTML declaration and the head and body wrapping. Inside the body, you could see this tag app root, which is a placeholder for the default component app component inside the app folder here. So here we have the default component app component, and you could see the selector here app root. So whenever a tag is created with this selector, this component HTML will be replaced there. So whatever is there inside this HTML will be replaced in place of this selector. So this tag will be replaced with this component HTML here. And this is responsible for the default view of the app. Now there is one important thing you should know about Angular. Everything in it will be organized into modules. By default, there will be only one module, which is app module. You could see the corresponding TypeScript file here, app module.ts. So every component inside this module will be there inside this app folder here. And you could see the module name prefixed along with this component selector here, app. So this is the default module, app module, and you could see the same inside this main.ts file. This is where every execution starts. The app module is bootstrapped here. So that's the brief description on how an Angular app works. Now let's start customizing the app as per our requirement. For that, first of all, I want to show you the structure of the app that we want to build. For that, I'm going to create a new text file here called app structure. Now let me paste this structure here. Now, as I already mentioned, we'll be implementing the CRUD operations using payment details of customers. So here we have the corresponding components, payment details, which is the parent component, and here we have the child component payment detail form just to design the form for the entity payment detail. Already existing payment details will be listed inside this parent component here. And we'll be creating an additional folder called shared. Within that, we need to create a service file and a model file for the entity payment detail. Now that's all about the app folder. Now we'll be designing this application using Bootstrap and Phone Awesome icons. So both of their CDN reference will be added to the root index.html here. Along with that, you could see this stars.css, which is the global style sheet for this Angular application. Inside that, we'll be adding global CSS rules. Now let's make these changes inside the application. For that, first of all, I will switch into the Z mode. So go to View, then Appearances, then Z mode. Or you can use the shortcut, hold Ctrl, then press K, release both of them, then press Z. I really like this Zen mode because it reduces a lot of distractions inside the IDE and also makes us more focused on the project. Now if you want to see the file explorer, you can do this, just grab it like this. Or you can use the shortcut Ctrl B. Now in order to navigate in between open files, you can use the shortcut hold Ctrl then press Tab like this. This way you can navigate open files inside the IDE. Now if you want to search and open any of the files inside the project, you can use the shortcut hold Ctrl then press P, then search for the file like this. Hit enter, that's it. Now to switch back to the recent file, use the shortcut Ctrl Tab like this. Always if you press the Ctrl Tab, the recently viewed file will be opened. Okay. Now in order to toggle the visibility of menu items, press Alt so that you can see all of the menu items like this. Now let's start creating these components here. So I will open the terminal like this. Currently there is only one tab inside that we are running this Angular app. Now in order to create these components here, we have to execute some Angular CLI commands. So I'm going to open one more tab like this. Now in order to hide this long path directory, I'm going to execute this command prompt then $G. This will only work if the terminal is open in command prompt. If the tab is open in PowerShell, we can go to this drop down here, then click on command prompt like this, and thereby a new tab will be open in command prompt like this. Okay, now hit enter. So the entire path directory is hidden and only a simple like this will be shown. Now let's clear the terminal like this. First of all, let's create this parent component here, payment details. For that, we can make use of Angular CLI generate command. So here is the search result from CLI, and you can see the ng generate here. This generate command can create a lot of files inside the Angular app. So here is the documentation on creating a component. So here is the command ng generate component, the name of the component. So here we go, ng g for generate, c for component can be used in short. The name of the component that I will copy paste from here. Hit enter. That's it. So here we have the new component payment details. Inside that we have an HTML file and a corresponding TypeScript file also. Apart from creating these two files, you could see an update inside this app module.ts file. Inside that we have just added the newly created component inside this declarations array like this. So this will be automatically done by the Angular CLI itself with this command execution here. Now let's create this child component. For that, I can navigate the previously executed command with this upward arrow like this. Since we want to create this component inside this parent component folder here, I will do this / the name of the component. Hit enter. So here we have the new component folder. Within that, you could see the corresponding component HTML and TypeScript file. Normally, when you execute a component creation command like this, for a single component, there will be 4 files created. But while creating the Angular app itself, we have specified that we don't want to create the component specific style sheet or test file. So that will be saved inside this angular.json file here. So you could see the schema updated here to skip component specific style sheet and test files. The same options that we have used while creating the Angular app is also present at this component creation command level also. See? So you can use these options to a specific component generation command also. Now let's create the service and model class for payment detail. For that, let me create this terminal. In order to create a service class, you can use this same generate command. You could see the corresponding command here under services. So here is the command ng generate service. Now here is the service file that we are going to create. So here we go, ng generate s for service, the name of the service that I will copy paste from here. Now since we want to create this service class inside the shared folder, we have to specify it like this, shared / the name of the service class. Even for a service class, there will be a test file. We have ignored that with the option that we have used while creating the Angular app. And thereby you could see the schema updated for the service class here. See, the test file will be skipped. Now hit enter. So here we have the service file created inside the shared folder. Now let's create this model class. Unfortunately, there is no CLI command for creating a model class. So we'll be using this class creation command with some tweaks. So here is the command and you could see the corresponding short version here. Now in order to create the model class, I will be using the service class creation command and let's modify it accordingly. Instead of a service class, we want to create a class file, in short CL. Now if we execute this will create a file with the extension TS. But it is recommended to have this extension model.ts for model class files. So we can make use of this option here, type. So this is how it can be done. Type is equal to model. Hit enter. So here we have the model class created with the extension model.ts. Now let's hide this terminal. So far we have created everything that we want to add into this app folder. Now I'll be designing this app using Bootstrap along with phone awesome icons. So let me add the corresponding CDN reference into index.html. So go to the official Bootstrap website, getbootstrap.com. Inside the home page itself, you could see the CDN reference for the style sheet here. Let me copy this. And let's paste that inside this index.html inside this head tag here. Now let's grab the CDN reference for phone awesome icons. Most often I will copy the CDN reference from this website cdnjs.com. I will copy the reference for this all.min.css and let's paste that just below this Bootstrap reference. Now we only need to add some styles into this global style sheet here that we can add later. Now let's start designing the app from this index.html itself. Now inside this body, we could see the app selector for the default app component here. As already mentioned, it will be replaced with the HTML from this app component here. Now in Angular 16, instead of providing component tags like this, we can use self-enclosing tags like this. So this is added to the latest Angular 16 and this is only available for custom components that we create, meaning it's not applicable to default HTML components like this div here. It's not allowed to add a div with the self-enclosing tag like this. So hope you understood. Now let's move to the default app component HTML. So this whole HTML elements is responsible for the default view of the application here. We don't need them, so let's get rid of them. Now let's start with adding Bootstrap container class. And I will be using method abbreviations like this for adding HTML elements. So this will add a div with the class container. Okay. Now let's hit tab. So here we have the div with the class container from Bootstrap. Inside that, we'll be adding a Bootstrap grid system. So first of all, we need a div with the class row. Immediately inside that, we need another div with the class col8. So this column will take 8 columns out of 12. And in order to center the same, we will apply offset of 2 columns from both of the sides. Now hit tab. So here we have the parent div and inside that we have the grid column. Hope you understood how method abbreviations works. Trust me, it will help you a lot in designing the app. Now inside this div, we want to show the parent component here, payment details. So here is the corresponding selector. Let me copy this. Now let's switch back to the previous tab. So you can use the shortcut Control Tab. That's it. Now let's add a self-enclosing tag with this selector. That's it. Now you see we are showing the default text from the component that you can see inside the HTML part of the parent component here. Now I will split this parent component into 2 equal halves so that we can show the form from the child component on one side and in the other half we can list existing records For that, we can use Bootstrap grid system like this, a div with the class row, and in order to apply margin from the top of the range 5, we can add this class, and inside that we need div with the class called 6, and we need two divs like this, so multiply by 2. Now hit tab, boom. Now inside this first column, we'll be showing this child component here. So let me copy the corresponding selector. Now switch back to the recent tab using the shortcut Control tab. From now onwards, I won't be repeating the same shortcut again. So remember the shortcut Control tab to switch back to the recently working tab. Okay. Now let's add the component selector here. Now inside the second half, we'll list existing payment details. So here we go. Now, while verifying the working of this .NET Core API, we have inserted a record into the table payment details, as you can see. So next, we'll be listing such existing records inside the second half here. Before that, I just want to add an app header about this Bootstrap grid. So first of all, we need a div. Apply this background color from Bootstrap, body secondary. In order to align the text in center, we can add this class. In order to apply vertical padding of the range 5, we can have this. And finally, in order to round the corner, this class can be applied, rounded of the range 2. Hit tab. So here we have the div created with mentioned classes. Now inside that, we need an h1 header with the class display6. And in order to apply extra thickness, let's add this bold class. Inside that, we'll have the app header like this, payment detail register. So here we have the app header. Okay. Now it's time to retrieve and display existing records from ASP.NET Core Web API into this Angular app here. For that, we have to make a GET request into this running instance of ASP.NET Core Web API. That can be done inside this Angular service class payment detail here. In order to make an HTTP request from Angular app, we'll make use of HTTP client from Angular. So here is the corresponding import statement, Angular/common/HTTP. From that, we want to import this HTTP client. Now let's inject an instance of the same inside this constructor like this, private HTTP of the type HTTP client. Now, in order to make use of this HTTP client, we have to add the corresponding module into app_module.ts file here. We just need to add the corresponding module into this imports array. So HTTP client module. For HTTP client related classes, the IDE is not providing the auto suggestion, so we have to add the corresponding import statement. Actually, there is a workaround to fix the problem, but it only works sometimes, so I'm not going to get into that. So let's add the import statement manually like this, and from that we want to import this HTTP module. That's it. Now back to the service class. Now in order to make the GET request, I will add this function refresh list. Now we can make the GET request like this. HTTP.get method can be called. Inside that, we have to pass the URL of the API. Instead of hard coding the variable inside this service class, I'll be using environments configuration files. Currently inside this app, we don't have the environments folder added by default. We can create the folder with the cling generate command. So here is the command for creating the environments folder. Let me copy this. Now let's execute that inside the terminal. So here we have the new folder with these two files, environment.development.ts and environment.ts. Inside these files, we'll be saving the configuration data for the app. This development file will be used while we are in development stage. Once we publish the app in a server, this environment.ts file will be used. When and which file is to be used is specified inside this angular.json file here. That's why when we executed this command here, this angular.json file is updated. If you check the same, by default, when the application is published, this file will be used. And when we are in development, meaning we are currently in development stage, so this path will be used instead of this path. Now we can check whether we are in production stage or development stage inside this serve here. This is the command that we use while running the app, like ng serve, right? So you could see the default configuration here, development. Okay, so this file will be used for development and this file will be used for production. Now let me copy the base URL of the API. Let's save it here, API base URL. Since we want to append the API part in all of the URLs, I will append the same here also. Okay, now let's copy paste the same inside this production file also. Now let's check how to access these values from our service file here. Now we'll add this URL property here, which is of the type string. Now let's retrieve the base URL from the environment file. So I'll be using this import statement here, this one, okay, so which is just saying that inside the src folder we have this folder environments, and we are only specifying environment based on whether we are in development stage or production stage. Angular determines which file to be used, so we don't need to worry about that. Now we can retrieve the value here, API base URL. Into that we have to concat the rest of the URL, which you can see here, payment detail. In order to avoid the typo, I will just copy that from here. Now let's pass the same into this getWeb method URL. Now this getWeb method will return an observer, which you can see here. Now we can subscribe to it like this, subscribe. Inside that we will have this object. In order to handle the success response, we can have this next callback, and we can also have the error callback here. For now, I will just print the error object. Now inside the success response, for now, let's print the returned response object. So this will make a GET request to the running instance of Web API to retrieve the existing payment details. Now we'll invoke this method from the parent component here because we want to list them inside the parent component. The form will be rendered from the child component. We don't have to worry about that now. For now, let's retrieve and display the records inside the second half here. Now, in order to invoke this service class method from this parent component, we have to inject the service class inside this component here. So first of all, we'll have this constructor. Then let's inject the service class here, payment details service. Now we have to invoke the service method once this component is fully loaded. For that, we can make use of the corresponding lifecycle hook. So first of all, let's import this interface on init. Just place the cursor on the component and then click on quick fix and then click on implement interface on init. So here it is. Now from this method, we can call this service method like this, service.refreshList. So this method will get invoked once this component is fully loaded. Okay. Now let's try whether the return response is printed into the console tab or not. Let's reload the app. Let's open the developer console. We got an error from the API saying that this request from this Angular has been blocked by course policy. I already knew this is going to happen. I just want to make you understand that it is okay to get errors while developing an application. It is very common. That's how we developers learn new things. Especially in today's world, we developers are the only people who face failures on a day-to-day task. And we always find a workaround to fix the problem. So don't worry. First of all, we should know what is meant by course policy. This CORS is an abbreviation for cross-origin resource sharing. And it's a security feature that you could see in all of the Web API. And what it says that when an application tries to consume this Web API, which is hosted in a different domain or different port number, it will block the request. Even though both of these Web API and Angular app is having the same domain, which is localhost, their port numbers are different. So this Web API blocks the request from this Angular app here. Now, in order to consume this Web API from this Angular app, we have to change the configuration of this Web API to allow requests from this Angular app or its URL. For that, back to Visual Studio, where we have already opened our Web API. Now, inside this program.cs file, we can configure the CORS policy. app.useCORS method can be called. Now the placement of this method invocation statement is important. Make sure that it is placed in between this use authorization and this if clause here. Okay. Now let's configure it accordingly using this lambda expression. Options dot with origins can be called. Inside that we will specify the URL of this Angular app here, and thereby it will allow the request from the Angular app. Now make sure to remove the / at the end. Now in order to allow any type of method, whether it is get, put, post or delete, we have to invoke this method. And in order to allow any request header configurations, we can call this method. Now this Web API is already running here. In order to reflect the new changes, let's save this, then build the project. Okay, that's it. Once the build is successful, new changes will be reflected inside the running instance. Now let's reload the app again. Boom, that's it. So here we have an array of objects returned from the Web API. Now we want to render the same inside this second half here. For that, first of all, we have to save the returned array of objects inside a variable, and we'll be saving such properties inside this service class so that we can share them across these parent component and child component here. Now to save the list of payment details, let's define this model here, payment detail. Now actually we are going to define a model class corresponding to this C# class here. Now you should remember what we have discussed about case conversion. When data is returned from Web API, the Pascal casing is converted to camel casing, as you can see in this returned array of objects. The exact opposite will happen when we send data from our Angular app to this Web API here. That is, this camel casing will be converted to corresponding Pascal casing. Now let me tell you why I emphasize this conversion again and again. Let's define a corresponding property to this C# property inside our model, Angular model here. It would be payment detail ID, which is of the type number, and I will initialize that with 0. Currently Angular is running on strict mode, so when we define or declare a variable, we must initialize them. Now let's talk about this property here. This property is the exact camel casing of this C# property here. See, the first word, first character is lowercase. Now suppose while naming this property, you made a typo like this, ID in all uppercase. Here is the problem. When we submit data to the Web API using an instance of this model, it won't bind to the corresponding Pascal casing of the property inside our Web API here. For example, inside this controller we have this post method, and it is having a parameter of this model payment detail. This camel case property will not bind to this C# property here, because once this property is converted to Pascal casing, it would be like this. The ID will be still in uppercase and it won't bind to this property. Thereby, the data that you have passed to this Web API won't be processed as you expected. So make sure to name them properly. And I will give you a small tip here. You could either copy the object like this and pasting them inside the model here and make the modifications accordingly, or you could copy the object from this Swagger UI here. See, inside this post Web API method, just copy this and pasting them inside this Angular app model. Okay, now first of all, we have to get rid of these double quotes so we can make use of the VS Code shortcut for multiple selection. So first of all, I will select the first double quotes here. Now use the shortcut hold Ctrl D to select the same occurrence in rest of the quotes. So keep hitting Ctrl D so that it will select all of the occurrence of double quotes like this. Or you can do the same with one shortcut. Just select the double quotes like this and use the shortcut Ctrl Shift L. Then just hit backspace so that we have get rid of the double quotes inside the copied object. Now if you want to know such helpful VS Code shortcuts, I have given the references in video description. Now here we already have the type of these string properties. Now let's specify the same for this primary key, which is number. Now let's initialize that with the default value 0. Now we have to get rid of this comma at the end, and we have to initialize these string properties with an empty string, like we have initialized this number property here. So what I will do is I will remove this first comma here. This property is already set. Now in order to initialize all of these properties all at once, I will add the comma here, and then I will use the shortcut. First of all, I will select this first comma, then I will use the shortcut hold Ctrl then Shift L. So all of these commas is selected. Now we can initialize all of these properties all at once. So hope you can understand how much these VS Code shortcuts or smart decisions or moves like this help you to save a lot of time in the development process. So here we have the Angular model created corresponding to the C# model here. Now back to service class. Now I will define an array list which is of the type payment detail. So here we have the import statement of the model class from this file here. So this is an array of the model class, and I will initialize that with an empty array here. Now within this success response, I will assign this response, which is this array of objects, into the new array that we have created. So here we go, list is equal to response. Now we have to convert this into an array of payment detail. Now let's show the same inside this parent component here. So here is the parent component HTML. Normally I render the array of objects inside an HTML table, but this time I'll be using Bootstrap unordered list. First of all, we need this unordered list from Bootstrap having this class list group, and we need an immediate li child for the same. We'll be iterating the array over this li element here. So here we have the ng4 directive, ng4. Now the list of payment details is there inside this service class. We have already injected this service class inside the component here, parent component here. So we can iterate through the array like this. Let PD, in short for payment detail, of service.list. So this is the array from the service class. Now this array of list is of the type payment detail model class, and it is having these much properties. Now for now I will just show the owner name like this, pd.card owner name. Let me save this and then back to the app. Boom, that's it. So here we are properly rendering the list of payment details that we have retrieved from the Web API. Now let's customize the appearance of this list here. For that, into this li element, I will be applying these Bootstrap classes list group item. In order to set the display into flex, I will apply this class. Now in order to distribute the elements evenly on horizontal axis, justify content between. Now in order to start aligning items from start, I will add this class align items start. Now we'll add a bottom margin of the range 2. Then we need border, horizontal padding of the range 4, vertical padding of the range 3, and we want to make the corners rounded of the range 3. So this is how it looks now. Now let's show rest of the details. For that, first of all, I'll be adding this div having this bold class. We want 2 divs like this. So here we go. Apart from this, we need to show card number and the expiration date. Card number, then expiration date. First of all, we'll be having the card owner name. Then after that, we'll be having a div for the card number. Then expiration date inside this last div. So this is how it looks now. Now along with these details, I want to show a button for the delete operation. For that, I will be wrapping these card details inside a parent div like this. For that, you just need to select these 3 divs that we want to wrap with another div. Then use the shortcut Ctrl+Shift+P. Then search for wrap with abbreviations. Select that. Then type div. Now as you type the abbreviation, this selection will be wrapped with the same. Now finally, you must hit enter. Apart from this, I will be adding a span like this. Inside that, we'll be showing a phone over sum icon for the delete operation. Now let's search for an appropriate phone over sum icon. So go to the official website here, phoneoversum.com, and click on icons and search for trash bin. Let's filter the free icons. Now I'll be using this icon here. Now click on this HTML tag to copy the same, then back to the app and just paste it over here. So here it is. Now in order to expand this div to the available space, I'll be applying this Bootstrap class flexGrow1. And then I will be applying this custom class mouse hover, which I will be adding inside the global style sheet in a bit. Now I want to change the color of this delete icon text secondary. And to enlarge this for icon, we can use this for LG class. And in order to change the cursor, when we hover the item, we can have this custom class mouse hover. The same is applied here. Now let's add this custom class inside the global style sheet, styles.css. So this is how it looks now. Now inside this parent component, we'll be listing the existing payment details records like this. Now let's design an Angular form inside this style component so that we can submit the form data for inserting a new payment detail record inside the Web API. So head over to the child component payment detail form, which we are already showing inside the parent component first half here. Okay, so head over to the child component. Now in order to design the form, I will be adding a property of the type model class inside this service class here. So here we go, form data, which is of the type payment detail model class, and we'll initialize it like this, new payment detail. Now we'll make use of this property in order to design the form. So we have to inject the service class inside this form component like we have done inside this parent component here. So let me copy paste this constructor into this form component here. Now in order to add the import statement for the service class, place the cursor at the end of the service class here, then use the shortcut Control then space. So here we have the corresponding import statement. Now let's design the form using the service class property form data of the type payment detail model. So back to the form component HTML. First of all, we need a form element. We don't need this action attribute. Now all the HTML elements for a specific property inside the model will be grouped inside a div like this. Div having the class mb-3, meaning bottom margin of the range 3. Inside that, first of all, we need a label. And along with that, we need an HTML input element like this. By default, the type of input control will be text, so we don't need this type attribute here. First of all, let's add the input controls for this model property card owner name. So let me copy this. Inside this label, we'll show card owner name. And we want to apply these bootstrap classes form control. And in order to make the control a little bit larger, we can add this extra class form control LG. Then after that, here we have the placeholder name on card. Now we are going to bind this input control to the service class property here form data. So each of the input control will be binded to the properties inside this model class here, card owner, card number, etc. Inside the service class, this form data property is already initialized with the default value of the model, which you can see here. All of the string properties are initialized with empty string, and this ID property is initialized with 0. Now we need to bind this card owner name to the corresponding input control here. We'll do that using two-way data binding in Angular. For that, first of all, we need to assign a local reference like this card owner name. Into that, we will assign this ng model. Now, this is how we define the two-way data binding. First of all, we need this syntax like a banana inside a square bracket. Now, inside the parenthesis, we have ng model. Now, here we have to specify the corresponding property from the injected service. So here we go, service. This is how we have injected the service class into the component. Then inside that, we have form data. Inside that, we have this property card owner name. Now, while doing this binding, we must assign the name attribute here as card owner name. Now, in order to work this two-way data binding, we must import the corresponding module, forms module, into this app module.ts file. So here we go, forms module. Now let's save this and back to the app. See, here we have the label input pair for the property card owner name. Now in order to style the form elements, let's add few CSS rules into the global style sheet styles.css. Fine. Now while making changes inside the application, sometimes the running instance of the app might be crashed. If that happens, you could see the detailed info inside the terminal where we are running the Angular app. Now, if you think there is no error inside the developed app and still you are getting an error inside the terminal, better restart the server. That might resolve the problem. In order to restart the server, first of all, use the shortcut Ctrl+C to stop the running instance, then re-execute the ngserve command. Now, let's add input controls corresponding to these three properties here. So I will copy paste this div 3 times. First of all, we have card number. Placeholder will be 16-digit card number. Now let's update the rest of the properties accordingly. For that, first of all, I will select this local reference. The same is used inside this name attribute and inside this two-way data binding here also. So I will use the shortcut Ctrl+D to highlight the same. And I will paste the card number like this. Then we have security code. Placeholder will be CVV. In some countries, it will be referred as CVC. Now let's update this attribute like we have done before. Now we want to show the type character inside this input controls as dots. For that, we can set this attribute type as password. Now finally, we have expiration date. I will specify the placeholder as the format that we are expecting for this control. Now let's update these attributes all at once. Let's save this and back to the app. So here we have rendered all of the form controls for the visible properties inside the model. Finally, we have to add the input hidden field for this ID property. Because when we submit the form, if we want to retrieve the value of the ID property, we must have a corresponding input control inside the form. So here we go, input of the type hidden. Name will be payment detail ID. We'll assign the value like this using the attribute value of the input control directly. Service dot form data payment detail ID. Now finally we need to add a submit button for the form. So at the end of the form we'll have this div. We want to apply the display of the type grid. Inside that we need a button having these bootstrap classes btn then btn lg to make the button larger, and we'll apply the color with btn success class. Now let's set the type of the button as submit. Inside the button we will be having this text submit. Boom. So here we have completed with the form design. Now finally I have a small requirement to show both of these security code and expiration date in a single row. Now let's move these divs for security code and expiration date into it. Now finally for both of these divs we want to apply the bootstrap class cos6 to divide the row into two equal halves. For that I will be using the VS Code shortcut multiple cursor. That will be like this. First of all I will place the cursor over here, and at the same time I want to add one more cursor here inside the first div here. For that hold Alt then click here. That's it. So whatever we type it will be appended in both of these places. That's it. Now let's submit this form so that we can insert a new record into the existing list of payment details. Meaning we are going to insert a new record into the SQL Server table through the .NET Core API post web method here. For that, first of all, let's wire up a function to this form submit event. So here we have this submit event. We will handle that inside this method on submit. Into the same method we'll be passing a local reference of this form like this. Form is equal to ng form. Now we can retrieve the data of the form controls within this form using this local reference here form. So we'll pass that to the on submit method. Now let's define this method inside the TypeScript component here. This method has a parameter of the type ng form. The shortcut control space is not helping to add the corresponding import statement, so I will add it manually here. Import from Angular forms, we want to import ng form. In order to insert a new record having values from these input controls, we have to make a post request to this web API here. For that, inside this service class, I will be defining a new method, post payment detail. Now, in order to make a post request, we can make use of this HTTP client object HTTP here. So this .http.post method can be called. As a first parameter, we have to pass the URL of the post request. It will be similar to the get request, which you can see here. The URL of this get request and this post request is same. So we just need to do this .url, which we have already generated up here. Now, as a second parameter, we have to pass an object containing the values of the new record, like we have passed inside this Swagger UI post request body. For that, we can directly pass this form data object here because we have designed the form using the same property using two-way data binding. So whatever changes we made or user makes inside the input controls, the same changes will be reflected inside the corresponding service form data properties here. So the current value of the form data represents the value of the object which is to be inserted. So here we go, form data. Now this post request returns an observable. Now from this method, we'll return the observable like this. Now let's call the method inside this form submit event. Service.post payment detail. It returns an observable. Now let's subscribe to that here. Subscribe. Into that we'll pass an object having this success and error callback. For now, inside this success callback, let's print this response into the server console. Now let's check how it works. First of all, let me open the developer console. Now let's insert a random record. Now we have to make sure that the card number must not exceed 16 characters. So I will copy the card number from the existing record here. And let's change the first number. If the card number exceeds 16 characters, there will be an error inside the server API. Don't worry about that, we'll implement the validation in a bit. Now let's provide the security code. It must not exceed 3 digits. then expiration date, month, and year. Here also maximum we can have 5 characters. Now let's submit the form. Boom. So here we got the response. Looks like everything went successful. Let's check whether the record is inserted into the table or not. That's it. So here we have successfully inserted the record by making the post request here. This post request will consume the post request inside this .NET Core API here. We have already discussed what's going on inside the web method before. Now, in order to refresh the list on the right hand side to include the newly inserted record, we have to make one more GET request like we have done inside the parent component ng onIt lifecycle hook here. Inside that, we have called this refresh list. From that, we have made a GET request to retrieve all of the existing records from the table. So here is the corresponding GET web method. Now, in order to avoid making an extra GET request for updating the list here, I'm going to update the post request response as you can see here. Currently, the post request return the newly inserted object. Instead of that, I will return the entire list of payment details from the table here so that we can avoid the extra GET request to update the list here. It's completely up to you how to return the response from these web methods. If you are concerned about a delayed response due to the extra retrieve operation, or you want to follow the solid state principle, you can keep these web methods as it is. Then you have to make a separate GET request to refresh the existing list of records. So here we go. Instead of this created@action method, I will call this method OK, meaning everything went successful inside the post request. Now we just need to copy paste this entity framework core statement to retrieve all of the existing records from this get web method. Now I want to do the same for the update and delete operation, because after both of these update and delete operation also we want to refresh the list. So I will return the entire list of payment details after update and delete operation. Now let me save this. In order to reflect these new changes inside the running instance of the .NET Core API, we just need to build the project here. Now in order to refresh this list after the post request, we just need to update this success callback like this. This dot service dot list. This list property is used to render items inside the parent component. So by updating the array here, the render list will be updated. So here we go, response. So the entire array of payment details is assigned to the list. Now we just need to convert into an array of payment detail model. Now the app is already reloaded while we are making the changes inside the app, and thereby the list of payment details is refreshed here. Now after any successful operation inside the form, we want to reset the form. For that, I will define a method inside the service class reset form with a single parameter form of the type ng_form. Now let's add the import statement like we have added inside this form component here. In order to reset the form, first of all, we have to call the reset method from this ng_form object. So here we go, form. Inside that we have another object with the same name, form, and from that we just need to call this method reset. Since we have designed the form using this service property form data, we have to reset that also. This dot form data is equal to new payment detail model instance. Now let's call the same inside this success callback here. Service dot reset form, and let's pass the form object. Now let's implement the form validation. Before that, I want to show a notification after any of the success operations saying the operation is successful. For that, I'm going to make use of the npm package ngxtoaster. I have used the same in previous Angular project. Here is the package ngxtoaster. Now before installing this notification package, make sure to check these dependencies here. Based on the version of Angular you are using, you have to install the corresponding ngxtoaster version mentioned inside this table. You could see the version of Angular you are using inside the project from this package.json file here. So here's the Angular core package, and you could see the current version you are using. Since we are using the latest Angular 16, we can go with the latest version of the package. So I will copy this installation command. Now inside a new terminal, I will paste the copied npm command, hit enter. Once the installation is successful, let's hide the terminal. Back to app module.ts file. There are few initial configurations to be done inside the app module.ts file. As you can see here, this is a dependency package for this ngx toaster. It's been there in Angular by default. You could check that inside the package.json file here. So it is already installed, so we don't have to install it separately. Now we have to make some initial configurations for the package. So here is the first step, where we have to add the style sheet of the package into the angular.json file. So here is the path. Let me copy this. Open angular.json file. We need to add this path into the array styles. So I will search the same here, styles. As you can see, there are two arrays with the same name, styles. So here's the first one. Now let's add the same path into the second array also. Now here is the final configuration. Open app module.ts file and then add these modules into it. So here we have the app module.ts file. Let me copy this and pasting here. Now let's copy the corresponding import statements also. Now let's make use of this package inside the form component here. We want to show a successful notification after the insert operation here. For that, first of all, we have to inject the toaster service here. So toaster of the type toaster service class. The toaster service must be imported from ngx toaster. So let's correct it here. Now let's show a notification after the insert operation here. Toaster.success method can be called. As a first parameter, we have the message of the notification, which is inserted successfully. As a second parameter, we have to pass the title of the notification. I will pass it as the name of the app, which is payment detail register. Now let's check whether it works or not. For that, first of all, we have to restart the application because we have made changes outside this src folder, which is inside this angular.json file. So whenever we make changes outside the src folder, it's better to restart the server. So let me open the terminal where we are running the server. To stop the execution, use the shortcut Ctrl+C and then re-execute the command ngservo. Let's insert a new record. Submit the form. Boom, that's it. So here we have the notification saying the operation went successful, and here you could see the newly inserted record. Now finally we have to implement update and delete operation. Before that, let me show you how to validate an Angular form like this. Inside this form, we want to make all of these input fields as required or mandatory to submit the form. Now we can specify the validation rules directly inside the form HTML elements here. In order to make this text field for card owner name as required, we just need to add the attribute required like this. We want this same required validation for rest of the form controls, so I will copy paste that here. Now we want to limit the number of characters entered into these text boxes here. For card number, it will be 16 characters, that of security code will be 3, and finally inside the expiration date, we only allow 5 characters. So first of all, we have card number. To set the character length, we can use these attributes min length as 16. Then we have max length. So both of them is assigned with 16. So we must provide an input having 16 characters. Now let me copy paste this for rest of the input controls. For security code, we need 3 characters. And that of expiration date is 5. Now we have to highlight invalid form controls, and also we have to restrict this form from submitting when this form as a whole is invalid. In order to know whether this form as a whole is valid or invalid, we can make use of this local reference of the form here. That is, inside this onSubmit event, we'll only make this post request when this form as a whole is valid. For that, we can add this if clause. Inside this form object, there is a boolean property valid indicating whether the form as a whole is valid or not. So we'll only make the post request if the form as a whole is valid. Now let me move this post request into the if clause. That's it. Now let's highlight invalid input controls inside this Angular form. For that, we can make use of ng classes provided by Angular itself. For example, let's inspect this card owner name. Here you could see the ng class ng invalid indicating the control is invalid. For this input control, the validation rule says it must be required or mandatory before submitting the form. Now whenever I start typing inside this control, you could see that the ng invalid clause is replaced with ng valid, meaning the control is valid now. Similarly, you could see the same ng clauses applied to rest of the input controls to indicate whether the control is valid or invalid. So based on the absence and presence of this clause ng valid or ng invalid, I will highlight the invalid form controls. For that, I will add a custom CSS rule into the global style sheet here. Inside the form, if there is an input element having the clause ng invalid, we will change its border color. See, by default, all of the input controls are invalid, so you could see a red border around them. Instead of this, I only want to show these validation error indications once users submit an invalid form. Now to know whether this form is already submitted or not, I'm going to add a new Boolean property into this service class, which is form submitted, which is of the type Boolean, and we will initialize that with false. Now we'll set this property with true once we submit the form inside this form component. So here we go, service.form submitted is equal to true. So inside the form submit event, we have set the property. Now from this property, we could say whether the form is already submitted or not. Now I want to reset the same property inside this reset form method. Form submitted is equal to false. Now in order to know the value of this Boolean property inside the HTML, I'm going to assign a custom class to this form here. So this is how we can apply a class based on a condition. Class dot, we want to apply this class, custom class submitted when the property service dot form submitted is true. So when this property is true, this class submitted will be applied to this form element. And also I have forgot something. I want to remove the default HTML validation. So I will set this no validate. And also if you don't want to show this autofill with previously posted data, we can reset this property autocomplete as off. Now back to validation. Based on the value of this property, the class submitted will be applied or added to the form element. Now we can change this style here. When a form having this class submitted contains an invalid input control, then we will show the red border. Let me save this. Back to the app. So initially we have a fresh form. Let me submit the form. Now we got the error indication. Now once we populate this form with valid data, the error indications will be gone. See? So this is how we can implement validation in an Angular form. Next, we are going to talk about update operation. For that, user want to click on this list item here, then the corresponding record details will be populated inside the form, and then he can make the required changes. Once the user submit the form, the new changes will be updated inside the DB and the updated list of records will be refreshed. So first of all, let me add a click event for the list item here. So here we have the parent component where we have the list of payment details. Now I'm going to add the click event to this div here. So here we go. We'll handle that inside the method populate form. Into the method, we will be passing the record corresponding object for the record. So that will be this variable here or property PD, short for payment detail. Now let's define this method inside the parent component. It has a single parameter selector record, which is of the type payment detail model. Inside that, we have already injected service into this parent component. Now we just need to update this property to populate the corresponding record inside the form here, because we have designed the form using this service property form data. So here we go, service dot form data is equal to selector record. Now once we select a record, the corresponding record is populated inside the form. But there is a problem. When we make changes inside the form, the same changes could be seen inside the corresponding list item here, because this object is directly assigned to this property, so they share the object reference. Instead of that, we will copy the object and then we will assign to this property, and thereby we could avoid this problem, because user might think the changes is already done inside the server side also, but actually we are only changing the service property form data. So in order to avoid this confusion, we'll make a copy of this object and then we'll assign to this form data. For that, we could do this object.assign method can be called. As a first parameter, we'll pass an empty object, and we can pass the second parameter as selected record. So a copy of this object will be created and then that will be assigned to this form data. Now the problem will be solved. See? So that's all about selecting a record for update operation. Now once the user submits this form with updated values, we want to update the record with new values. But inside this form submit event, we have already implemented the insert operation by invoking the post web API method. But here is the catch. Based on the value of this primary key property payment detail ID, we could say whether we have an insert or update operation. By default, the value of this property payment detail ID is 0. So if this ID property is having the value 0, then we have a fresh form, meaning we have an insert operation. If it is a non-zero value in case of this form here, then we have an update operation. So based on the value of primary key, we could say whether we have an insert or update operation. So this is what I will do. I will create a separate method called insert record, having the same parameter form. Let me copy this and paste it here. Now like this, we need one more method for update operation. We have already implemented the insert operation here. So let me move the same into this insert method. Now we just need to invoke them based on the value of the primary key. If it is equal to 0, then we have an insert operation. So I will invoke the method insert record here by passing the form object. Else we have an update operation. Now for this update operation, first of all, inside the service class, we have to make the put request. For that, I'm going to create another method. So let me copy paste this post method. This will be put payment detail. Here we have to make a put request into this web API method here. So along with the URL, we have to append the ID of the record. Let me append the ID here. So as a first parameter, we have the URL. And then as a second parameter, we have the form data. It contains the updated value of the record. So this will make a put request to the corresponding web API method, and thereby the record will be updated with the new values. Now let's invoke the same inside the form component here. It will be almost similar to invoking this post method here. So I will copy paste that here. Let's invoke the method put payment detail. The put web method also returns the updated list of records. We'll assign the same array into the list, and thereby the list of records will be refreshed. We'll reset the form and we'll show the toaster notification with a different background color, blue color. So we'll invoke this method info and the message will be updated successfully. Now let's check whether it works or not. Let me update this record for August. I'll change the name. In order to make sure the update operation is working in all of the fields, I will append this 30 in all of these fields at the end, 30 and 30. Now before submitting the form, let me show you the current value inside the DB. So these are the current value of the record. Now let's submit the form for the update operation. Boom. So here we have the success message, and you could see the changes inside this list already. Let's re-execute the select query. That's it. Now finally, we have to implement this delete operation. For that, we can add a click event to this trash icon here. So open the parent component HTML. Here we have the fab icon. Let me add a click event here. We'll handle the event inside a method called onDelete. Into that, we just need to pass the ID of the record. So payment detail dot payment detail ID. Now let's define the method. Here we have a single parameter ID of the type number. In order to remove a record, we have to make a delete request to this web API method here. So first of all, I will define a service method to make the request. For that, let me copy paste this method. The name of the method will be delete payment detail, having the parameter ID of the type number. In order to make the delete request, we just need to pass the URL appending with the ID like we have done for the update operation, nothing else. So we can pass the URL like this, ID parameter is appended at the end of the request. Instead of put, we have to call the delete method here. Now let's call the same method inside the component TypeScript file here. Service.delete payment detail. Into it, we just need to pass the ID. Now we just need to subscribe to it. So I will copy that from the form component here. Now the end subscribe method invocation is copied. Let's paste it over here and let's make the required changes. Inside this success callback, the return response will contain the new list of payment details. We have assigned the same to the array list. Let's get rid of this. We don't need to reset the form for delete operation. Now, in order to pop up a notification message using toaster, first of all, we have to inject the same into the component. So I will copy paste the injection from this component. Now let's add the corresponding import statement. Make sure that it is importing from ngx toaster. Now we want to show the notification in red color, so I will call this error method and the message will be deleted successfully. Now before trying this delete operation, we want to confirm the operation from user side because delete is a loss of data. So I will add this if clause here, if, and we want to show a confirmation dialog from our client side using this JavaScript method confirm. Inside that we'll ask this question, are you sure to delete this record? Now the delete operation will only happen once user confirm the operation. Currently you could see these are the 3 payment details record. Now I want to delete this record for Daniel. So click on this trash icon and here we have the confirmation asking, are you sure to delete this record? Click on OK, then it will delete the same. Boom, that's it. So that's it guys. Here we have implemented the CRUD operations in set, update and delete with Angular and ASP.NET Core Web API. You can download or clone this project from the GitHub repository. I have given the link in video description. For more awesome videos like this, please consider subscribing to this channel. If you haven't yet, please like and share this video with your friends and colleagues so that they can also benefit from this. Have a nice day. Bye.